that I essentially stole the title from one of my former students. I'll advertise her book, Piety and Fanaticism, Rabbinic Criticism of Religious Stringency by Sarah Epstein Weinstein. Now, basically, what she dealt with there is in certain ways what we're dealing with here. What do the Talmudic rabbis think of piety versus fanaticism? Now, some definitions for a moment so that you'll realize what we mean when we talk about piety and fanaticism. Generally, people understand piety as coming from the Latin word pietas. Now, this is a noun from the adjective which would be pronounced pious in Latin, which is pious in English, which means devout or good. Now, generally in Latin usage, this referred to somebody who had a whole bunch of virtues combined, and these included responsibilities to gods, country, parents, and family. And this is generally what they mean by piety. Now, what we mean by piety, I think, being what we think is the right way to be very religious. Obviously, we may disagree about what that means, and we'll get into that problem as we go along. But I think that that's how we use the word. Now, fanatic, this is a tough word to define. One could get into the psychological dimensions of fanaticism, a subject of which I know nothing about. But to stick to the parts that I do know, it represents somebody who has an irrational zeal for something, and therefore, essentially, gets, we might say, out of control from our point of view. But let's just remember that these are subjective judgments. That is to say that what I look at as pious behavior is because I think it's the right behavior. If somebody, for example, is a Rastafarian, and his idea of piety is to sacrifice animals in the local park, I will think that this is a crazy thing to do. But he thinks it's a pious thing to do. And I think we have to admit that things that everyone in this room does, say in preparing for Pesach, might appear to some outside person to be total fanaticism. So we have to admit that these are subjective terms, and we use them in that way. Now, is it working? Okay. So, now, when we start to talk about this subject, there is in Judaism a classic example of the person who is supposed to be a zealot. And that classic example informs much of the discussion that we're going to have today and has informed much of the discussion throughout history. This is Pinchas. You'll all remember that Pinchas, in the book of Numbers, sees an Israelite involved in an immoral action with a non-Jewish woman, and he manages to stab them in a way in which, according to the way at least the text was understood by the rabbis, makes the point, let's just put it this way, about the immorality of their actions. Now, this story was considered by the rabbis in a very strange way, because they invented a retroactive halakha to claim that what Pinchas did was okay, while simultaneously actually saying that if he would have asked the question of the court, he would have been told not to do it. So what you have here is a recognition that Pinchas acted in a certain sense as an extremist fanatic in a given circumstance, that if one of us would ever come to the rabbi and say, hey rabbi, this is going on right now in the house next door, the rabbi would say, please do nothing, absolutely nothing, don't do anything, call the police. However, when Pinchas acted, he somehow or another is legitimated for his action, while at the same time, you might say, being criticized. Now what you have here is, I think, a recognition of the fact that we have to seek balance in these types of things. What's really interesting, though, is that the Pinchas example on the good side comes in the book of Maccabees. Because in 1 Maccabees, Mattathias, starts the revolt, and the whole description is a description of Pinchas like the book of Numbers. When you read the books of Maccabees and the story of Mattathias stabbing the Jew who is willing to perform the pagan ritual when they come into his town, Modi'in, they get all the people together. This is what they're doing, and the official of the Seleucid Syrian army, he says, well, who wants to come forward? Some guy finally comes forward. He's ready to perform the pagan ritual. Mattathias takes out his sword. He stabs the guy, and that's the beginning of the revolt. But the description I gave you is like a newspaper article. The description in the book of Maccabees is a description of Pinchas. And therefore, you see that sometimes this idea of zealotry can actually be praised, because sometimes it can be right. So this is another very important point about what I said was subjectivity, is that we have to admit the fact that there are times when zealot-type action may turn out to be the right action and may actually save the Jewish people or save us from paganism or who knows what. And I think we can all conceive examples of such a thing. But in general terms, you don't do it. And if you ask about it, you're told not to do it. Now, therefore, you can understand that in general terms, in the normal life that most of us have, the rabbis are against, in the Talmud, what we would call fanaticism in virtually every single time in which they discuss it. And in fact, if you look through this book, we'll see she considers in the volume numerous examples of where in various issues, I'll give you an example, there apparently were some women who basically prayed all day. And it's called Ishat Salyanit. And this woman who prays all day, this is criticized by the rabbis. They criticize also people who decide to be celibate on their own, or who are excessively ascetic. Various types of what they regard as extreme religious behavior. And after the destruction of the temple, we have rabbinic texts which criticize people who are going to never eat meat or drink wine again. And this is despite the fact that soon after the temple's destruction, such apparently fanatical examples of mourning for the temple became quite widespread. So in general terms, we have the idea that zealotry might belong sometimes, but doesn't belong usually. And if the act of the zealot is going to be a violent act, it's virtually 100% that if asked the question, the rabbis would say, no, you don't do such an act under any circumstances. Even if, ironically, in the case of Pinchas himself, he's retroactively excused. Now, this is the first of the things that we need to know. But what I want to point out to you as I go on is I'm using a technique today which is a little different from most of my own talks, in that there isn't necessarily a logic that connects the sections. I'm giving you a bunch of things you need to know to understand the problem, and then we're going to tie them up later. It's a sort of, for those who attend a lot of lectures, it's a British method. That's what they do very often. They throw out information, you have no idea what the connection is. What is this guy talking about? And then it all works at the end. So on some level, right, what I want to do now is, having given you this piece of background of Pinchas as the example, I want to go into the situation in Second Temple times when we have a variety of groups, some of whom morph into such zealotic type groups and essentially extremist groups. Now, you know, of course, everybody talks about the Pharisees and the Sadducees in that period. The Pharisees are the forerunners of the Talmudic rabbis, the Sadducees the high priestly group. Forget them today. Because those are the people who are what, let's just call it this way. Again, this is very problematical because it is a subjective division, but they are not fanatics or extremists or anything like that. They're the regular people in the Second Temple period. But what we want to take a look at briefly is some of the sectarianism that goes on. And here, the most important group that at least we know about is the Dead Sea sect. Now, I don't just say that because, as one of my friends said, I make my living from studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. I say it rather because of the fact that we have so much material from them, and you can see it as a model